PlayStation 1. The original PlayStation exists because Nintendo screwed Sony over in the most public way possible. Late 80s, Ken Kutaragi, the guy who'd later be called the father of PlayStation, built the sound chip for Nintendo's Super Nintendo. That relationship turned into something bigger, a CD-ROM add-on called PlayStation that would let Nintendo games use way more storage and better audio. Partnership seemed solid. Then, 1991 hits, and Nintendo walks onto the stage at CES and announces they're ditching Sony for Philips. Just like that, in front of everyone. Sony's CEO could have killed the project. Instead, he told Kutaragi to build a console that would compete directly with Nintendo. Revenge fueled this thing from day one. Here's what made it work. CDs versus cartridges. Nintendo 64 cartridges held 8 to 64 megabytes. PlayStation CDs, 660 megabytes. Manufacturing a CD cost Sony $1 or $2. Cartridges, $15 to $25. Third-party developers saw those numbers and jumped ship. The PlayStation also enabled full-motion video, orchestrated soundtracks, and actual voice acting, things cartridges couldn't handle. The tech was built around a MIPS processor with a geometry transformation engine that pushed about 360,000 polygons per second. It skipped the Z buffer to cut costs, which meant textures warped and polygons flickered. That jittery look wasn't a style choice, it was a budget decision, but it became iconic. PlayStation 2. The PS2 is the best-selling console in history. 155 million units. That record still stands. 3 things made it happen. Everyone loved the original PlayStation. It played DVDs when standalone players cost over $300. And Sony promised Toy Story quality graphics. A massive exaggeration, but we believed it. The heart was the emotion engine. A 128-bit CPU with 2 vector units for physics and geometry. The graphics synthesizer had 4 megabytes of embedded RAM with 48 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. That's why you could have all those smoke effects and transparency layers. But the architecture was a nightmare to program. Early games barely looked better than Dreamcast titles. Some teams wrote assembly code just to unlock performance. When they figured it out, the results were stunning. However, Sony had a genius pricing strategy. They priced the entire PS2 console at $299, making it cheaper than a regular DVD player since the PS2 could play DVDs out of the box. It was a 2-for-1 deal, and those 8.5 gigabyte discs enabled GTA San Andreas scale worlds. The original launch models had full backward compatibility with actual PS1 chips inside, waiting to be used for old games. Later models stripped that out. Slim models removed the hard drive bay entirely. PlayStation Portable. Sony called this the Walkman of the 21st century. A MIPS processor at 333 MHz and a 4.3-inch widescreen that pushed graphics comparable to early PS2 games. The problem was the Universal Media Disc, Sony's proprietary 1.8 gigabyte optical format. The mechanical drive caused slow load times, drained the battery, and made a distinctive whirring noise. They tried pushing UMD movies, which flopped. The slim models doubled RAM from 32 to 64 megabytes. Then, in 2009, the PSP Go removed the UMD drive entirely. All digital with 16 gigabytes of internal storage. It was a preview of today's digital-only future, but it failed because you couldn't transfer your UMD library, and it cost more. PlayStation 3. In 2006, Sony launched PS3 at $599, a full year after Microsoft's Xbox 360 hit the market. They weren't selling a game console, they were selling a supercomputer. The Cell broadband engine was a collaboration between Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. One PowerPC core plus 8 specialized processors called SPEs, 6 usable for games. Developers had to manually manage memory between all these processors. Early multi-platform games ran worse than Xbox 360 because the 360 had a simpler architecture. It took years to unlock the cell's potential. Sony also used the PS3 to win the Blu-ray versus HD DVD format war. That expensive blue laser drive caused delays and forced Sony to sell consoles at a massive loss. And again, the launch models had actual PS2 chips for backward compatibility. Later models, however, removed that entirely. Sony initially let you install Linux. Researchers built supercomputer clusters with PS3s. Then, after a hacker exploited it, Sony removed the feature via firmware update. That led to a lawsuit they eventually settled. PlayStation Vita. PS Vita launched with a quad-core ARM processor, powerful GPU, dual analog sticks, and a gorgeous 5-inch OLED screen. The hardware was impressive, and the launch model's display was truly stunning. However, a later revision switched to LCD to cut costs. It worked, but colors looked washed out. Here's what killed the Vita: pure corporate greed. Sony refused standard SD cards. Instead, they forced a proprietary format on us. Not only were these cards prone to corruption and failure, they were 5 times more expensive than a regular SD card. That pricing strangled digital sales and made people hesitate to buy the system. The PlayStation TV was a microconsole version that connected to TVs, but was incompatible with touchscreen-dependent games. It confused consumers. The Vita had the specs and games. Sony's proprietary storage killed it. PlayStation 4. After the PS3 disaster, Sony listened. Mark Cerny led the design with one philosophy: make it easy for developers. No exotic processors, no complicated memory management, just something familiar. AMD Jaguar processor with 8 cores, and a Radeon GPU pushing 1.84 teraflops. The genius was the memory. 8 GB of unified GDDR5 RAM with 176 GB per second of bandwidth. CPU and GPU shared data seamlessly. Compare that to Xbox One's slower DDR3 with a complicated ESRAM cache. Developers loved it. Multi-platform games ran better on PS4. The share button turned every player into a potential streamer. Though, if you owned a launch model, you definitely remember the sound. Booting up high-end games turned the console into a literal jet engine, preparing for takeoff in your living room. But despite the noise, the PS4's success came from humility. Sony learned the best technology gets out of the developer's way. PlayStation VR. With PlayStation VR, Sony brought VR to the console masses through accessibility. A 5.7-inch OLED screen at 120 Hz with 960 by 1080 resolution per eye. It used the PlayStation camera to track LEDs on the headset. Outside-in tracking, less precise than HTC Vive, but way cheaper. High-end PC VR required an expensive rig. PlayStation VR just needed a PS4. Games like Astrobot Rescue Mission proved you didn't need cutting-edge tech for incredible VR experiences. Sony proved VR could work outside the PC enthusiast bubble. PlayStation 5. The PS5's entire philosophy boils down to 2 things: eliminate loading times and make games feel more real. And they nailed both. The custom 825GB NVMe SSD has hardware decompression that pushes 5.5 GB per second raw, up to 9 compressed. That speed lets developers stream assets instantly. Ratchet & Clank, Rift Apart, has you jumping between completely different dimensions with 0 loading. The DualSense controller ditched rumble motors for voice coil actuators that simulate textures, like rain, sand, and ice. Adaptive triggers adjust resistance dynamically. Pulling a bowstring feels different from a gun trigger jamming. The hardware, AMD Zen 2 CPU, RDNA 2 GPU at 10.28 teraflops, 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, is powerful. But the SSD and haptics make the generational leap feel real. PS5 Pro. PS5 Pro is where AI enters console gaming. The GPU got more compute units, faster memory at 576 gigabytes per second, hitting 16.7 teraflops. Storage doubled to 2 terabytes, but the killer feature is PlayStation's Spectral Super Resolution, PSSR. It's Sony's answer to NVIDIA's DLSS. The console uses machine learning hardware to upscale lower internal resolutions to 4K output. It analyzes previous frames and reconstructs fine details through neural networks. For years, gamers chose between performance mode for 60 frames per second or fidelity mode for 4K visuals. The Pro eliminates that compromise. You get both. This is Sony betting on machine learning as the next evolution in graphics. Honorable mentions. PocketStation. Japan got this memory card handheld hybrid in 1999 with a monochrome screen and mini-games from PS1 titles like Final Fantasy VIII. Sold 5 million units, but never released in the West. PS4 Pro. The first mid-generation refresh in 2016 that broke traditional console cycles. Doubled GPU to 4.2 teraflops and introduced checkerboard rendering for 4K. Mid-cycle upgrades are the norm now. PlayStation Classic. Sony's 2018 attempt at a retro mini-console that flopped. They used an open-source emulator on cheap hardware and included 50 Hz PAL versions in North America, causing stuttering, a rare Sony legacy misfire. PSVR 2. Released in 2023 with inside-out tracking, eye-tracking cameras, and foveated rendering that renders only where you're looking in full resolution. In 2024, Sony released a PC adapter for Steam VR access. PlayStation Portal. Started as an 8-inch remote play device. Late 2025, they added cloud streaming directly from servers. Now you don't need a PS5. It's a glimpse at PlayStation as a service you access anywhere. And that's 30 years of PlayStation. From a revenge project born out of corporate betrayal to an AI-powered ecosystem that's untethering from physical hardware. Sony went from disrupting Nintendo's cartridge empire to almost destroying themselves with the Cell processor, then came back by listening to developers. So which PlayStation had the biggest impact? The original that changed everything? The PS2 that became the best seller of all time? Or the PS5 that killed loading screens? Drop your pick in the comments. I'm genuinely curious what you think. I will see you in the next video.